Great. So good morning. This is the a joint meeting with the House and Senate Transportation Committees. It's on Wednesday, February 28th. And we have some wonderful presenters here with us this morning from NCSL and the Eastern Transportation Coalition. And as both of our committees have been talking a lot about transportation revenue and funding, thought it would be helpful to hear kind of a national perspective and to hear what other states are doing, because Vermont is not alone in this. So we have really some great expertise with Doug Schenkel, who's the Associate Director of Environment, Energy, and Transportation at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And we have Patricia Hendren, the Executive Director of the Eastern Transportation Coalition. And so welcome to virtually joining our committee. I'm so appreciative for you making the time, taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. And we wish you could be here in person with us, but now with our technology, this is the next best thing. So I think you have a kind of a joint presentation, but who Trish, are you kicking us off?
I sure am. So let me go ahead and I'll share my screen and I'll get some thumbs up from you all if that is working. Let's get that in. Okay, there's our thumbs up.
That's great. Okay. We can hear you loud and clear. This is great. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Well, actually, I want to thank you all for having this really important conversation this morning. And as was just mentioned, Vermont is not alone in this challenge of how we find a way to sustainably fund transportation. So I think what Doug and I wanted to do is bring in some insights and lessons learned from around the country as you all are looking forward to continue some of the great work that you've already started in Vermont to identify that sustainable funding approach for Vermont. So that's the idea for today, to definitely have a discussion. And to do that, we were going to do a little passing the Zoom ball between Doug and I. So I'll start out just setting a little bit of the transportation funding stage, and I'll toss the ball to Doug, and he's going to do a deeper dive into some funding trends, and then he'll pass the ball back to me to talk about, again, some of those lessons learned from work around the country. So you all are the State and Senate Committee on Transportation. So this is probably near and dear to your hearts. It is to Doug and I that transportation is just very important. It is what gets people to work, to our kids to school, or us to the doctors, or those packages on our front door. And it really is, transportation is that mobility provider, that economic engine in our states, and really that provider of opportunity. The challenge is that the revenue that we use to support that key kind of lifeline of our society and our economy, the amount of revenue we're collecting as transportation industry for every mile driven in that system is going down. And then I think even more important is if we ask our neighbors how much you pay in fuel tax, they're going to tell you how much they pay in fuel. So that number that's listed at the gas station when you go and fill up is what people think they're paying the government to keep our roads going. So there's a lot of just misunderstanding about how in the world transportation is funded. And then EVs are here. I think it's been a little while now, at least over a year, that we've had the Ford 150. So that is our most popular vehicle that's sold in the country. And given that that is electric, I think was a big wake-up call that our fleet is changing, which is going to change our revenue and that kind of link between use and payment. So what that all means, I'm a data geek, so I have to throw up some data every once in a while. So the identity of this state has been hidden to protect the innocent. But this is just one analysis in a state in the eastern part of our country where we're looking in just 2030, which is crazy to think it's just around the corner, given conservative projections on how many vehicles are going to continue to improve, going farther on a tank of gas, and then that orange little area about the vehicles that are going to be all electric. In 1 year alone, you're going to see a pretty notable decline in revenue. And if we go out to 2050, which still feels far in the distance, but that's when we really see the impact of this changing fleet, of how we really are interacting with our roads and bridges, really takes a toll. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? We need to find that sustainable approach. And so I'm going to pass the Zoom baton to Doug, and he's going to share basically some trends going on around the country related to transportation funding. So take it away, Doug.
Thank you very much, Trish. While I get my screen and pull my presentation pulled up, I just want to express my appreciation to Representative Coffey, the chairwoman of the House Transportation Committee, for hosting us, and for Senator Mazza and Senator Perchlik and everyone else on the Senate Transportation side for joining in as well and making this a joint committee presentation. So as Representative Coffey said in her presentation, my name is Doug Schinkel. I work for the National Conference of State Legislatures. I hope you're all familiar with who and what NCSL is. You are all members of NCSL. If you are elected to office as a state lawmaker, you automatically become a member, and all of the legislative staff that I see kind of in some of the offices and in the committee room are also members. And really the purpose of NCSL is to provide an opportunity for you to learn from your peers in other states, your other laboratories of democracy. And certainly on this topic, transportation funding, there is a lot going on in the moment. So I think this is a very kind of, the timing is great and a really fortuitous conversation to have about what states can do to kind of diversify their transportation funding streams, recognize that the proliferation of electric vehicles, yes, but also just vehicles getting more better fuel, having better fuel efficiency has a negative impact on gas tax revenue, which is typically the largest source of revenue for a state. We'll get into talk about that a little bit more. Yeah, just want to express my appreciation and put in a plug. Representative Coffey has been participating in our alternative transportation user fees partnership, and that's how we kind of got to know each other and how she came to invite me to present to this. And that's an ongoing effort that we'll be doing, having some more meetings over the next year. So I'm sure Representative Coffey will be sharing some more resources from that. And also just wanted to plug that we have our large annual legislative summit in Louisville, Kentucky this year, August 5th to 7th. So hoping many of you, guessing some of you have attended in the past, and hoping some of you can attend this year. So with that, I will get started. Let's see, how do I, oh, there we go, sorry. So this first slide is information. Let me just make sure I'm in the right place. Yep. This first slide just shows the kind of a pie chart of the revenue sources, the state's revenue sources for state transportation funds. This information is from the National Association of State Budget Officers, who we work with quite closely. And really the big takeaway that you'll see here is that the motor fuel tax made up 37.6% of state transportation revenue in 2023. That is a decline of 3.5% from 2016. So we're seeing that those gas tax revenues decline pretty steadily every year. And of course, that depends on the state, but that kind of is an ominous sign of what may transpire in the years ahead, and kind of what Trish pointed to in a few of her slides. So of course, feeling like I'm missing something in here. Okay, so sorry about that, jumping around. So just wanted to mention, you know, I think y'all, as everyone's familiar with gas taxes, and that those have been one of the main sources to pay for transportation. There has been quite a bit of gas tax action in the last 10 or 11 years, although that has lessened the last few years. I think states are becoming more reluctant to raise gas taxes because they don't really think that's necessarily the source of the problem, the downfall that states are dealing with. You will note that Vermont did raise their gas tax in 2013. And then you also note that 24 states and DC have indexed or variable rate gas taxes. What that means essentially is that the gas tax in some way tracks with the economy or with population growth or inflation. And Vermont indexed their gas tax in 2015, which I think is a good move to make sure that your gas tax is keeping up with kind of inflationary pressures on labor, construction materials, et cetera. And you'll see a couple examples of states that increased their gas taxes just last year. So I thought this was interesting. Trish suggested that I include this, and I'm glad that she did, just showing kind of your peer states and the percentage of state transportation revenue derived from gas tax revenue for your kind of peer surrounding states. Noted, as I'd kind of discussed with Representative Coffey before, Vermont's actually not super reliant on the gas tax, which kind of puts you in a probably much better position in some ways vis-a-vis, you know, compared to Maine, who is very reliant at 63.4% of their transportation revenue is derived from gas tax. And you have states like Pennsylvania, which are in the 70% range. So that gives you kind of a sense of that. And that does vary a lot. And that points, you know, some states do contribute more general fund dollars, or they have, you know, like a sales percentage of a sales tax. And so there are some options out there. So I'm going to talk primarily about user fees in my presentation, primarily about user fees. So really looking at how users of the transportation system, and especially roads, how they're paying in the system. So one of the obvious ways that states have been moving towards is creating these flat registration fees when you register your electric vehicle. So there are now 34 states, and you can see those states in green on this map that have electric vehicle registration fees. There are also 18 states that have plug-in hybrid fees. I do not have those denoted on the map, but they're essentially some of the same states. The EV fees, as you see here, range pretty widely from $50 to $225. I know, you know, recognize that Vermont's probably a state that is that is putting more emphasis on the electrification of the transportation sector. There's, of course, some concern from the environmental community that such a flat fee would dissuade the purchase of electric vehicles. So some states like Hawaii, which is also a state that's really trying to go all in on electric vehicles, they're down on that lower end at $50. But you do have other states that are much higher. And some of the research that we've seen coming out too shows that there's not the kind of the threat of that annual registration fee, which is on top of the existing registration fee that you're going to pay annually, but that enhanced electric vehicle registration fee isn't necessarily going to dissuade anyone from purchasing an electric vehicle. Electric vehicle is so, you know, expensive enough on its own that another couple $100 isn't going to make a huge difference. Some of these have been tracked, have been indexed to inflation as well. There's 6 states, I believe, who have indexed their fees, so they do increase incrementally over time. So now let's talk about road usage charges a little bit, also known as mileage-based user fees, which I think is the term that perhaps is more prevalent in Vermont. But road usage charges, what does that mean? That essentially means that theoretically, you can in practice have systems that can collect a charge based on the miles driven by a particular vehicle. So essentially a per mile charge. And this map has a lot of information in it. It's from our partners with CDM Smith, one of the groups we work with, and a group that I believe that the state of Vermont works with. And this map just kind of shows the range of activity around road usage charges around the country. The 4 states in kind of is that dark blue. I'm always a little bit colorblind. Yeah, let's say dark blue, which are, or 3 states, sorry, Oregon, Utah, and Virginia have operational road usage charge programs, although they are all voluntary at the moment, and we'll get into that. And then Hawaii is going to soon join them as the 4th state with an operational program, and you'll see a bunch of other states that are doing pilots. They're doing research studies. There are states like Ohio, Michigan, Oklahoma, Texas that are doing surveys of drivers and of different groups of drivers. A lot of emphasis on the moment. I'm looking at rural drivers and tribal community drivers and what have you, to get a sense of how people kind of perceive this concept of road usage charges and their kind of receptiveness to it. So I want to talk a little bit just about the 4 programs, and there's a lot of information in these, and I'll try and kind of gloss over and just hit on the big pieces. But like I said, there are 3 states, soon to be 4, that have operational voluntary RUC programs. All of these have been established in state law through the legislature. So the legislature has played a big role in this, and I think that's important because this is a new thing, and you have to kind of, first of all, justify this to your constituents, right? Like, why are we doing this? You kind of have to make the business case that, well, we're seeing negative impacts on our gas tax, and so we're trying to figure out some way to collect revenue that's user fee based from electric vehicle and other alternative fuel vehicles. So most of these programs are open only to alternative fuel vehicles, although there's some exceptions in there. You'll see that, for example, Oregon's allows a few more vehicles in there. But like I said, these all have been created by the legislature. The mileage rates are all kind of in this like between 1 and 2 cents range at the moment. One of the big questions and considerations, I think, well, there's many, but one of them is which vehicles are eligible. Electric vehicles are kind of the obvious candidate, but actually some of the studies and the research out there that shows at the moment, a lot of the degradation of motor fuel tax revenue is really coming more from more highly efficient vehicles in terms of mileage. So you're not necessarily capturing that if you have a program that is just focused on alternative fuel vehicles. And so that's a little bit tricky to figure out how to make that work. And then another kind of thing to consider is who would administer this program. In Oregon, it's the Oregon DOT, but they actually have a couple of contracting firms that help that you can basically to give drivers a choice of who they want to have be kind of their vendor and process their payment and what have you. And then, of course, there's the question of how is this mileage reported and collected. In some states, it is with some sort of in-vehicle plug-in device. And of course, that raises privacy concerns, which states have tried to address through a variety of policies and giving consumers choices. But that's another thing that states are kind of grappling with a little bit here, but want to make sure to keep moving. So let's look at Virginia was the 3rd state to establish a voluntary RUC program. They've structured their program a little bit different, and Trish may have some insight on this as well. She's pretty well read on this program. But their program has the most number of drivers in it now. And that's kind of partly because of the way it's structured in the eligible vehicles. You'll notice here that electric vehicles are eligible, but also any vehicle over 25 that gets over 25 miles per gallon, I believe, has to participate, has to either choose this flat highway use fee, which is mentioned under other provisions, or enroll in the mileage use fee program. And so this question of whether you want to restrict this to just alternative fuel vehicles or open it more widely, I think is really important. Like I said, to make sure that you're capturing adequate revenue from those more fuel efficient vehicles, but also the more vehicles you get in these programs, the more you're achieving efficiencies of scale, and the more that these programs are going to be more efficient to administer. They're obviously not anywhere nearly as efficient as administering the gas tax at this juncture, and perhaps never will be, but I think they can probably get to a point where they're relatively closer. So Virginia's program is kind of motoring along, and has got a lot of folks enrolled in the mileage use fee program. And then the 4th state that will have an operational RUC program is Hawaii, and that will become the nation's first mandatory RUC program at one point. Right now, the eligible vehicles are only electric vehicles. That will start in July 2025. Hawaii has some clear advantages that do not apply to other states. They're an island, so you don't have to worry about figuring out, if you drive out of state or if drivers coming into your state, that's not really an issue for them. And they are one of 14 states that have an annual vehicle safety inspection. So they have a very simple way to collect this RUC. So you just go in annually, and they compare it to the year before, and then you pay your road user fee. That fee is capped at $50 annually. And that's one of the important things to kind of drive home that applies to all these states, actually, is that any of these states, all these states have the electric vehicle registration fee as well. If you opt into the RUC program, at the moment, you will not pay more in a RUC than you will pay in that flat fee. So they're really trying to create incentives to get drivers into the program. Then you'll note here with Hawaii that beginning in June 2028, that that will essentially this program will become mandatory for electric vehicles to participate in, and there are some future plans to transition the entire drivers in general to this. I'm not sure where the gas tax quite fits in that, whether they want to keep the gas tax or what have you. Once again, Hawaii is kind of a notable, an example that's maybe not so pertinent in some ways, but nonetheless very notable that they are on the path to a mandatory RUC for at least a certain subset of vehicle owners. I wanted to talk quickly about some other revenue kind of options out there. There are now 13 states that have established fees on transportation network companies. What are transportation network companies? They are Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing type services. Now, the fees vary from 5, 10, 25 cents per ride, somewhere in that range. Most of them are actually used just to kind of administer the safety and regulatory framework for the TNCs. But you'll note the states that are polka dotted here, those states have actually dedicated some portion or in some cases, I think all of the money to transportation trust funds. Massachusetts is an example of that. Georgia dedicated quite a bit of the fee revenue from Uber and Lyft rides to transit. In Colorado, where I'm based, by the way, I didn't tell you I'm based in Denver, Colorado. In Colorado, the money is being used to help with some electrification and trying to reduce emissions from transportation emissions. California is using the TNC money for a couple different purposes. So that's something we've seen more states do the last couple of years. Another notable thing that we saw just trends the last couple of years is that Colorado and Minnesota established via legislation fees on deliveries. In Colorado, it's a 27-cent fee. It applies to all retail and food deliveries and is projected to raise a significant amount of revenue, as you see there. Fees are collected by the retailer, and they are kind of funneled into some different funds, some of them that are more electrification and clean air oriented, but some that are more kind of traditionally transportation oriented. Minnesota is structured theirs quite a bit different. It's a larger fee, 50 cents, but it's only on purchases over $100. And it does not include food, which is a big distinction and difference. So they're obviously capturing a smaller group of delivery fees with that. But it will be interesting to see if more states kind of pursue these in the years ahead. I'm kind of guessing they will. And then one other thing, and I know I've had some conversations with Representative Coffey about this, but the other kind of most prevalent thing that states are looking at in terms of how can we capture user fee revenue from electric vehicle owners or highly fuel efficient vehicle owners. So 7 states have laws that tax basically electricity consumed while using a publicly available electric vehicle charging station. And the revenue from these 7 states that have created these fees almost entirely is dedicated to transportation infrastructure. And you'll see some of the details in here. So these aren't projected to generate a lot of revenue, at least in the short term, but I think it will grow over time. And one of the main considerations I've heard that's kind of perhaps a good argument in favor of these, and I'm not here to advocate for or against any of these, just really to present you with information, but and a kind of compelling argument is that this is a way to ensure that an electric vehicle owner that is driving in the state of Vermont on their vacation or on their way to Maine or on their way to Montreal or whatever, that would in the past have perhaps stopped at a gas station and paid some gas tax. Now they're not doing that with an electric vehicle. This is kind of the equivalent. This is a good way to capture revenue from out-of-state users. Now, obviously, in-state users that live in an apartment or don't have access to a charging station in their home, they would have to pay this as well. That's kind of what I've heard is one of the more compelling counter arguments. This is not really equitable because these fees thus far do not apply to in-home charging. Partly that's because the technology that would be necessary to do that is more complicated and more expensive. It's technically possible, and it may get easier over time, but it is a little trickier. And the other piece I would just say with all of this too is that you're interesting a whole new kind of agency and industry into this, right? The utilities, you're bringing in a group that, their interest is not necessarily in road maintenance and what have you. And so you're bringing in a new group that has to new groups and new actors that have to be involved. But most states have actually had the state kind of departments of revenue take the leads on these. Most of these have just started being implemented or haven't been implemented yet. So we don't have a lot of info, but like I said, not a lot of money expected to be derived from these in the short term, but that will obviously grow over time. And these are just a few resources, and I can share these in another format as well, but happy to take questions later in the presentation. But that's all I have for now. And so I will turn it back over to Trish, and I look forward to your questions later in the conversation. Thank you.
That's great, Doug. Thank you. And I'm appreciating how you've choreographed this. So
Well, that's a good check to make sure you're seeing my screen again. Did the Zoom ball go back? All right, I love it. Excellent. So thank you, Doug, for that. And I think the idea that Doug and I are trying to do here is really acknowledging where Vermont is. And, from the road user charge study and advisory committee that you all had, from the recommendations that you got from your transportation department of a potential mileage-based user fee on EVs, what we were thinking from discussions with Representative Coffey is, where do you go from here? So you have this potential new program for Vermont. You have the challenge that we're all facing in the country with declining revenue. And the question that we get a lot is, what do I do next? What do I need to be prepared for if we move forward with a MBUF EV only fee in Vermont? So this is kind of, I think I said in that presentation, it's like a field guide. Maybe that's the right description. Maybe this is from injuries that we've received, really exploring this transition from a fuel tax to a distance-based fee. What are we going to face as a state? And basically it comes down to these 4 big barriers. And what I want to do in the next couple of slides is just share how other states are looking to move past those barriers. So these are not a surprise to anyone in the room. I'm sure you think of them yourself when you hear, I'm going to start paying for transportation based on how many miles I drive. Well, that doesn't make any sense. There's this gap of understanding between most folks and how they use our system. That sounds like invading my privacy. Is that going to be fair? And won't that be expensive to create this new program? So diving into a couple of these, this is a transportation geek is what makes me sad. Actually, maybe it's like happy and sad. Maybe I'm talking out both sides of my mouth here. So a lot of the public, again, as I mentioned earlier, don't understand how they pay for the transportation system we have. So I brought some data from North Carolina, and that lower left number is great, right? That's not too bad. I have young kids. Maybe if they came back with a C-, I wouldn't be that excited. But still, having residents in your state say the roads here are pretty good, is as a good result. But then we look over on the right-hand side here, and people think our funding is going up, or they have no idea really how much they're paying. So if we're going to engage with Vermonters on change, we're going to have to really close that gap. So a couple of ideas how folks are doing that is really starting first with the value. Again, this is the committees on transportation. You're on these committees because my assumption is that you believe in the value of this system that was really helping the economy, bring tourists to your states, basically support the quality of life you have. But we don't talk about it very much. So these are some examples how in Pennsylvania, they're trying to, again, close that knowledge gap by talking about why transportation is important. And then in Virginia, before they launched their distance-based program, they wanted to see how to engage the public with this topic. And they talked about saving money. Do you want to be part of innovation? Are you concerned about the climate future? And do you really hate potholes? So I bring these examples to you all that we have ways to talk about transportation. I think we need to kind of strengthen that muscle and flex that muscle more as we're moving forward and how we fund transportation. So another way to close that gap is to give some information. So I can put into the chat, we have a video that we generically made for any state to use that just talks about how we've been funding our roads from a fuel tax for about 100 years. A lot has changed. And so it's kind of a little bit of a campy video to try to get people's attention. Again, I said I have 2 younger kids, and I think they get all their information from videos, which is a little bit shocking to me. So, but that is how we communicate. So how do we get little video clips out? Something for Vermont to consider. We also, on the coalition website, we have a calculator. Everyone always wants to know, what would this change mean for me? So right now I'm driving, her name is Old Bessie. She's a 24-year-old wonderful car, but I pay a lot per mile compared to someone else with a younger car. And I can use this calculator to see what it would mean for me if we switched to a distance-based fee. So again, just a couple of ways to kind of really start closing that gap. And then I had highlighted on some of these numbers. Everybody receives information different. I'm a numbers person, so I like this kind of stuff, but some people don't. But these numbers are big. And I think that's the idea, is to try to share some of these projections, not to terrify people, but to say that's why Vermont is thinking about acting today, is to make sure, again, this is another state that I won't share their name, because these are tough numbers. That basically between now and between 2030 and 2050, there's going to be a notable loss in revenue if nothing else is done. That loss coming from those fuel-efficient vehicles that Doug mentioned, as well as those vehicles not using any fuel at all, those EVs. So just some ideas. The last one is really reconnecting that link. So back in 1919, all the cars were the same. So a fuel tax was a user fee. The more you drove, the more you bought fuel. Everyone was kind of the same vehicle. But today, the range of vehicles out there, that link between use and payment, and that's what we need to talk to people about, that if you're using the roads, we need to make sure we pay for them. Kind of reestablishing that link is part of that solution. Okay, so then this one is tough. Anytime I talk about a distance-based fee, this is the thing people talk about first, is I don't want the government tracking me. We have a very strong sense of independence in this country, which is a privilege. But if we're going to talk to individuals about how we could, again, connect use and payment, we have to address privacy concerns. And the approach that Vermont is considering for your road user charge that will go for your EV vehicles, I think is a great way to address privacy, because it's not requiring kind of a tracker device. But still, there's going to be that perception. And I bring up these data here at the beginning of a pilot in these 2 states. This concern of a distance-based fee invading your privacy is really high. But again, some good ways to address that concern. Pilots, which in Vermont, you may skip over this step, but in some states, having a pilot, a demonstration pilot where you're not collecting money, is a way to get people to interact with the technology or their program approach, and it just lowers the temperature when it comes to privacy. So that, I'm a numbers person, so a decrease in just a few months of interacting with the technology from 64% concern down to 30 is pretty notable. So again, that kind of experiential, if I can say that word, learning is pretty key. Another way to address privacy, choice. Good grief, we love choice in this country. If you try to go buy cereal these days, I think it's like almost two sides of an aisle. Like, we like to have our options. We must give people choices in this future. And I think Vermont is considering that, different ways to collect the necessary data that you're going to need for a distance-based approach. Every state around the country that has looked at this has come back with that finding. So this is just something we're going to have to do if we go down this distance-based path approach. Participant agreements. Okay, who reads those things and they're like, sign here that you've looked at all the privacy concerns or everything we're going to do with your data. But they are really important. I will confess I don't look at them a lot of times, but as a public agency, we must clearly list how we're going to use the data, how we're going to protect privacy. So these documents are going to be very important for Vermont, and I know you all are looking into them. Legislation, that's again where you all come in. I have an example in Virginia. Before they launched their live program, which is now the largest in the country, their largest mileage-based usage fee program, they looked at their privacy protections they had in code, and they realized they needed to add some additional language for that specific program. So that is something that we encourage all states to look at their privacy protection that's kind of, in the books today. And as we have new programs, making sure we don't need to tweak that. All right. So the third, I think, real barrier that we keep hearing, and what Vermont will face if you all go forward with a distance-based approach, like every state has faced, is this isn't fair. But what's interesting, I think equity is a very tricky topic these days. What someone defines as equitable can really range based on who that person is. So equity can mean for a rural community, equity can mean it's not fair for EV owners who are trying to help our climate challenge by getting an EV. This isn't fair. And you can see some of the other examples here. So as we move forward, I think it's really helpful to talk about today. And I mentioned I have this old car, old Bessie. She gets a lot less miles per gallon than this lovely 2009 Toyota Camry. But I bring this up because nobody knows this, that just because you're able to buy a newer vehicle, you are paying less. And so how do we, as legislators in a state, how do we, again, kind of reconnect that use and payment? So I think starting with what today doesn't feel very fair. And when we do public opinion surveys about this, when we ask pilot participants, this is something that resonates. People are like, wait a second, that doesn't seem fair. We should all pay for using the road, and why should we pay so differently? So I think this is a place where we can address some equity concerns, and then bringing data into the discussion is going to be important. Everyone assumes that a shift from a fuel-based approach to a distance-based approach is going to hurt rural communities, but that's not what the data is showing us. So that's a really strong kind of core gut belief that we need to bring to those communities and say, look, you're actually paying more now in today's fuel tax reality because you drive longer distances and because your vehicles are consuming more gas per mile on average. So this change may actually benefit you. So is that going to make them be like, oh, great, sounds like a wonderful idea? Likely not, but I think it's important to have this information as we have these conversations with our different communities. Again, the myth, and Doug touched on this in his comments, there's this idea that if you have a distance-based fee on EVs, or if you have an EV fee, you're going to destroy the EV market. And we're just, again, the data isn't showing that. The data is showing that I think it's between, Doug said, between $50 and $200 of a fee is not impacting individual choice to purchase an EV. Those vehicles are expensive. And so that fee is not deterring this. So we need to make sure we're talking about this openly. So again, how do we dispel some of those equity myths? The other challenge, I think, as legislators, that you are setting policy in your state, that it's important to try to remind everybody what a fuel tax or RUC could, or MBUF could or could not do. So I bring this chart. I'm sorry, I'm going here with the data again. And what this is showing is, I think we all know this in our gut, that lower income households are paying more of their share of their household income on transportation. So transportation is something that we all need, again, to have that mobility, and lower income households are paying more of their share to get to where they need to go. So that makes us all be like, okay, if we want to address equity, that maybe we should focus there. But I bring up this that little orange section there is, I do not think that a fuel tax adjustment or a distance-based fee can solve our challenges with transportation funding and inequity. So basically what I'm trying to get to, put this little teeter-totter in here. Again, we've got my young kids. So this mileage-based usage fee approach that you all are considering can do a lot. It can reestablish that link. It can address some of the inequities today with regard to a fuel tax, but it's not going to solve a lot of our societal inequities. So I think we just need to enter into this with that knowledge. Okay, the last one, maybe I say this to last because it's one of the hardest, is going from a fuel tax to a distance-based approach is just going to be more expensive. So I hear often, why in the world would we establish a new way to collect revenue that is more expensive than our current way? That's a really good point. The problem is we're comparing two very different systems. If you looked at the fuel tax and the cost of collecting that fuel tax 100 years ago, it was really expensive. We have gotten a lot more efficient with that. And as Doug touched on this, we will get more efficient with a distance-based approach. How are we going to do that? Technology is going to be a big friend here. We have a lot of cell phones in people's hands. I got one right here. I'm sure everyone has one. Hopefully not looking at them right now, right? We're all attentive. These things are very distracting. But what I mean, or why I bring this up, is we have some ways to leverage programs. You all are looking at leveraging your annual registration fees, the interaction with your DMV as a way to implement MBUF. That's a really smart thing to do because it leverages existing programs. That will lower that implementation cost. And then the more we get, the more people are engaged or enrolled in these programs, the cost is going to go down. Just think about, we all love going to Costco and getting those good deals. So then there are some successes here too that we can highlight. All eyes are on Hawaii. I personally am hoping that they'll invite me to come out and inspect their program. I have not gotten an invitation yet. But they're looking at a lower cost way to implement their program that mirrors a lot of what Vermont is thinking of. So let's learn from them as you all are considering a path forward. So the last slide I'll have, and then as Doug and I have said, we welcome discussion and questions, is I truly believe transportation is worth paying for. And we need to, if we're going to move forward, we got to make sure that kind of we lead with that. So I will turn off my screen here and welcome some questions, please.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both Trish and Doug. It's been great to be able to participate in some of the NCSL meetings and convenings, and just appreciate you didn't just take those presentations and plunk them down here. You really tailored them to what some of the things that what our current practices here in Vermont are. So just really appreciate it, and I think it's helpful for the committees to see what other states are doing. So there are lots of different approaches that you kind of covered with road usage charge. And yesterday when I had an update yesterday on the work that our Agency of Transportation is doing with the plans to have a mileage-based user fee. We spent a lot of time last session kind of diving into that. So I want to I really appreciate all of this, and I want to open it up to questions from the committee, from both our colleagues in the Senate and the House committee to vote. Representative Bartholomew?
It seems like keeping a fuel tax could be considered a disincentive to keep buying more and more gas, but since people don't really know what they're paying in a gas tax, it doesn't seem very effective. So I'm wondering why the best approach wouldn't be to just use this mileage-based user fee for all vehicles. Why just electric?
So I can dive into that one and highlight what Virginia has done. And I think they are, to me, a real shining example of addressing today and tomorrow's program by including in their distance-based approach, their MBUF program, high efficiency vehicles as well as EVs. So they're the only one that has done that in the country, and they have it. It's a pretty elegant system that it is really based to make up that loss in fuel tax. So if your vehicle is on 25 mpg, you're paying an additional $6 a year in what they call a highway use fee. If you have an EV, you go up to more the top part of that fee, that highway use fee, which is around 130. So to get to the question, or why I'm highlighting them, I would say for a good example is it is not flat and the same for everybody. It's very vehicle specific. And as the efficiency of vehicles in Virginia changes, that highway use fee goes up. So it kind of changes over time. It addresses the fleet turnover over time and the choice. And I think it's pretty smart that Virginia calls their program mileage choice. Either you pay the flat fee, whether it be $6 or $130 a year, or you sign up for this distance-based approach. And that's when you pay that fee over time, or you pay less because you drive less. So I think you're hitting on the key point, which is just having an EV fee just having an MBUF on EVs is not going to solve our transportation problem.
Yeah, I think Trish, you really nailed it. That's the Virginia system is kind of elegantly constructed, and it is acknowledging the reality that it's not just electric vehicles that are causing this revenue degradation. I do think at the end of the day, this is a little bit, it depends on the kind of, it would probably be good to have an in-state analysis of kind of where that degradation is coming from, and your DOT may have access to that numbers, but I would tell you that some states, like I can think of some other states that they have told me that they're not interested in expanding it beyond maybe electric vehicles or alternative fuel vehicles at the moment, because there may be some political considerations there, but also just because they don't feel like that's necessary yet. I think there's a lot of folks out there too that think that just because you have a mileage-based user fee system does not mean that you can't have a gas tax system as well. The gas tax works very well. It's very easy to collect and administer, and there's going to be a certain subset of vehicles that do use fossil fuels, probably for a long time. And so you may want to keep that system in place, even if the amount of vehicles in it will decline over time. But I do think one of the more compelling reasons to move towards having more vehicles eligible to be in a mileage-based user fee program is just this whole idea of like the scale, the efficiencies. A lot of what is being done with the establishment of a mileage-based user fee in these states right now, in the conversations in Vermont, you're not expecting to necessarily generate a lot of revenue the first couple of years, but you're working out the kinks in the system, you're getting the public familiar with the system, and then you're kind of in a better position to actually scale up the program and have it be more efficient and have more drivers in it.
Well, I see, does Senator Chittenden have a question? I see him waving his hand. You're okay.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Coffey. I guess I'd ask about ad valorem registration fees, if that would be a way. I understand other states do that. When you register a car, a newer car that's more fuel efficient, when we enter the VIN number in, we could determine both the fuel source as well as very likely the fuel efficiency. Do you know of other states that are having a variable or by value ad valorem fee or even ad MPG fee onto the car registration to compensate for the lost revenues to their transportation funds?
Trish, I can speak to that first if you'd like. I did actually, thanks Senator for the question, did actually see a bill from Missouri the other day that is being considered this legislative session, and I can pass it along to you, both committees, that was considering exactly what you're suggesting. That would be a additional fee based on the value of the purchased vehicle the very first year of the purchase, and then you would continue to have to pay that other EV registration fee, but you would essentially have that value-based fee and then the flat EV fee. So that's I would have to check and see if there are other states that incorporate the value in some ways that actually exist now. But I'm aware of that Missouri example, which I can share, and then I can do some quick research and see if there are any states that have that system in place already.
Okay, see the thumbs up there. Great. Representative Campbell.
Thanks. Yes, I was wondering, Trish, you mentioned a couple of times that a mileage-based user fee is not going to replace the gas tax support for transportation fund. Are you talking sort of in the short term or in general, or I don't know, where do you see, or do you have an opinion or a sense of how we're going to fund transportation sort of sustainably in the future?
Right. I appreciate the question. So the short answer is replacing the fuel tax with a distance-based fee, I think is going to be too expensive. And that's going to get into rebates that you would have to process as a state. We have a lot of DMV engagement in the coalition, and the word rebate is something that stops them in their tracks. And I know Oregon and the beginning of their program, and Oregon, I think we need to look at their state and their work as really research and development And they originally set up their system that they would refund participants in their Origo program for fuel tax paid. And it was so challenging to do that they have stopped doing that. So the idea is continue forward with a fuel tax, because the vehicles that will be going to a gasoline station to fuel up will continue to pay that. But what we're trying to focus on is that revenue loss. So how do we make up for that revenue loss? And we can try to chase it by increasing our fuel taxes, but we won't succeed. Over time, there's just less and less vehicles using fuel at all. So I feel like I'm being a little long-winded in the answer, but so let me try to be more succinct. I think politically, public acceptance, it would be easier to, maybe I should say maybe not public acceptance. It is going to be tough to have the public accept, because there's no way for it not to feel like an additional fee. Sometimes I think that we've been giving our residents a tax rebate, but we've never told them, because they're paying less for every mile driven. But now it's a little, what is that expression? It's something's come home, the songs come home. I'm not very good at those expressions. I mix them all up.
You're watching the cows, yeah.
The cows are coming home, and it's time for us to say that. And what I've been encouraged is people are willing to pay to use our transportation system. So I said I was getting shorter and I went longer there. I apologize, but I think it will be more feasible to keep the fuel tax and add this additional revenue collection source to make up the gap that we're all facing.
Okay, just to clarify, you're saying that the DMVs think that having any kind of a rebate structure would just make it impossibly expensive to administer. Am I understand that correctly? And the rebate would be for, I think you mentioned for gas tax paid or something like that. I get, or another possibility might be a rebate for, say, an in-state resident paying a mileage-based user fee based on mileage from inspection to inspection annually, but then getting a rebate for if they use, let's say, a level 3 charger in state, which also has a KWH fee on it, to try to capture out-of-state users.
Right.
And so that would be another example of a rebate that would be hard to administer. Is that right?
Right. So let me separate those two. So looking at a rebate for if a vehicle household is involved or has selected to do a distance-based approach, but they're still paying fuel tax. What we're trying to give a rebate on is that delta between how much they were paying in a distance-based approach versus what they're paying in the fuel tax. So a lot of times that's just a couple dollars. So that's why the rebate is so hard. Unless I think, please.
But why are they paying a fuel tax if they're on an electric vehicle? A hybrid might be, yes, but.
Yeah, so it's a great clarification. So this would be for the vehicles that are filling up their tank. So when they go to fill up, they're going to pay a Vermont state fuel tax and a federal fuel tax. So I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, why would we not replace that fuel tax with a distance-based fee and be clean about it?
Right.
So the why not is because the delta between how much someone is paying in a fuel tax and what we're asking them. I feel like I'm like losing my point here. So let me try to regroup. A lot's going to depend on how you set that per mile rate. And right. Let me pause and have you ask me another question, see if I can do a better job of answering, which I think I'm not doing a good job. So try, yeah.
Well, so you mentioned a rebate in the context of people paying both mileage-based user fee and a fuel tax. But if, for example, a mileage-based user fee is only on electric vehicles, then those drivers or owners won't be paying a fuel tax too, because they won't be using any gas rather.
Correct.
So there's no rebate owed in that case.
Correct.
Right.
So in that reality, you would keep your fuel tax for Vermont in place, but there will be an additional MBUF for your EV vehicles because they're not contributing anything to the roads right now. But you raised an important point, which is what about miles driven outside of Vermont? So should a Vermonter have to pay for those miles? And I think the answer is no, but it is going to be very difficult to make that happen. So you could have somebody have a GPS on their vehicle, and then you could provide a rebate for those out-of-state miles. That's definitely a policy decision. And I think that's kind of one reason the coalition got involved in this, is to highlight the large share of out-of-state miles that happen in our region. So the same point, when people are visiting your beautiful state, shouldn't they be paying for the miles driven within the state? So that's why eventually this will need to go to a regional approach. This pop-up state by state will not work. So I'm giving a very long answer to your question, which was you're going to touch on a lot of very key points.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we're hearing from our agency too, that like we're in the beginning phase of this, and that regional, this regional approach will be needed. Never mind international states that have shared border like Vermont does with Canada. I wanted to make sure we're like, our time is coming almost to a close. I want to make sure that the Senate Transportation Committee, which I can't see as easily, but I want to make sure that you're getting any of your questions answered. I'm looking, are you all set, Senator Perchlik, with the committee?
Yeah, we're all fine.
Okay, great. Great. Any final questions from our committee? Great. Yeah, this was really excellent. Thank you so much, both of you, for making the time and for the presentations. And I think it just helps us realize that, it's really interesting for us to see what other states are doing, whether it's an MBUF or road usage charge or delivery fees, what other states are doing, to get a bigger picture of what some of the options are out there as we're making this big transition, more fuel efficient cars and also to electric vehicles. So this has been great. So thank you so much. I want to thank the Senate Transportation Committee for joining us this morning, and I would also put a plug in, if you can go to NCSL, it is a very time well spent, and there's the Transportation Committee and agenda is going to be more active on the agendas, from what I understand from Doug. Is that true? Oh, I think he might be frozen. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So I think some folks actually we all got emails that there's some folks from NCSL at the State House today. So we can connect those.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're gonna have a traffic safety pre-conference this year.
Great. Yeah, so there's a lot of good stuff there. Well, thank you both. And with that, I think we'll end our morning session.